My father came home from Vietnam in May of 1971 with a duffel bag, a folded flag he'd carried home for a friend who hadn't made it, and a set of nightmares that nearly killed him. He was 28 years old. He had served 2 tours as a rifleman with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, humping a rucksack through the hill country of Binh Dinh province. And whatever he saw in those hills he did not bring home in words. He brought it home in the set of his jaw when he walked into a room. He brought it home in the jolt that took him when the kitchen screen door slammed. He brought it home in the fact that he could not close his eyes in a dark room without his hands coming up in front of his face to guard against what was not there. For the first 3 months he was home, my mother thought she had gotten a stranger in place of the man she married. She told me this years later, not as a complaint but as a fact, like someone describing a flood that had washed through a house they once knew. My father would sit at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, staring at the back door, and when she asked him to come to bed he would say he was fine, and then he would not move for another 2 hours. He would go entire days without speaking. He lost weight he did not have to lose, and his cheekbones started to show, and it scared her. My name is Brent Tate. I am 56 years old, and I live on the same 110 acres in Wise County, Virginia, where my father was healed by something that lived in the woods behind our house. I am telling this story because my father asked me to tell it, and because he is gone now, and because I have carried it for 40 years, and the time for carrying is done. My father's name was Hank Tate. He was born in 1943 in a company house at the edge of a coal camp that doesn't exist anymore. His father worked underground for Stonega Coke and Coal, which became Westmoreland Coal after the merger in '64, and his mother raised 4 children on what a coal miner's wage could stretch into when it stretched at all. Hank was the oldest boy. He quit school in the 10th grade because his father's back gave out and somebody had to bring in a check. And he worked the tipple at the Westmoreland operation at Osaka for 2 years before he got drafted in the winter of '67. He married my mother, Phyllis Stapleton, 3 weeks before he shipped out. Phyllis was 19. Hank was 24 and had never been further from Wise County than a weekend trip to Bristol. He did his first tour with the 173rd and came home on leave in the summer of '69 for 30 days and was sent back before he could get his boots off. I was born in March of 1970 while he was over there the second time. He saw me for the first time in a photograph my mother sent him in a manila envelope that took 6 weeks to reach him. When he finally came home for good in May of '71, I was 14 months old, and I did not know him. I was told later that I screamed when he tried to pick me up. My mother said he handed me back to her and walked out to the porch and stood with his hands flat on the railing for a long time without moving. My parents were living in a small house on 110 acres that my grandfather Tate had bought in 1958 with money he'd saved from a lifetime underground. It was mostly timber, running up the east side of a ridge that formed one wall of a narrow hollow off the upper end of Callahan Creek, north of Appalachia. The nearest paved road was 3 miles away. The house had 4 rooms, a tin roof, a well pump on the back porch, and a wood stove for heat. Behind the house, the land sloped up through a cleared pasture about the size of 2 football fields into a band of second-growth oak and hickory, and then climbed into older timber, big tulip poplars and white oaks that had never been cut because the terrain was too steep to log without killing somebody. Above that stood a rim of sandstone that ran the length of the ridge like a stone wall built by giants. And beyond the rim ran a long, unbroken stretch of the Clinch Ranger District of the Jefferson National Forest. Miles of mountain and timber that ran north into the Cumberlands of Kentucky and south toward Tennessee. That ridge is where this story happened. The nightmares started the first night my father was home. My mother told me later that she woke at about 2 in the morning to him shouting in a voice she had never heard him use. A voice that was not my father's, but was coming out of his throat. Commands and curses and names that were not names she knew, rising in pitch until he sat up in bed with his hands out in front of him as if he were holding a weapon. His eyes were open, but he was not in the room. She tried to say his name. He swung at her. He did not hit her, but he swung, and it took everything she had to keep her voice steady while she said, "Hank, you are home. You are in Virginia. It is Phyllis." She repeated it for maybe 2 minutes before his eyes came back to the room, and when they did, he looked at her with an expression of horror worse than anything else that happened that night. He got out of bed and went to the kitchen and sat at the table and did not come back to bed. Within the first 2 weeks, he stopped trying to sleep in the bed at all. He would sit up in the chair by the stove and doze off for maybe 20 minutes at a time, and then he would wake up choking on a scream, and he would go outside. My mother could hear him walking. He walked the pasture at night, and sometimes he walked up into the timber, and he would come back at dawn with his pants wet from dew and his eyes burning from exhaustion and a look on his face that was not a man, but a man being held together by the thinnest thread she had ever seen. She tried everything. She made him warm milk. She talked to him about his brothers and sisters. She held me up to him and said, "Hank, this is your son. This is Brent." The only thing that ever cracked the wall was when I reached out one afternoon and grabbed his index finger with my whole small hand, and he looked down at me with an expression that was almost recognition, and for about 5 minutes he was there. Then he was gone again. She went to the VA in Johnson City. They gave her a bottle of phenobarbital and a pamphlet about combat fatigue and told her to make sure he ate. She drove home and sat in the truck in the yard and cried until she couldn't cry anymore. When she went inside, my father was sitting at the table with a pistol in front of him that she had not known he owned. He was not pointing it at anything. He was just looking at it. She walked over and picked it up and walked out to the back porch and threw it into the rain barrel, and she came back inside. "Hank Tate, if you leave me alone in this house with this baby, I will never forgive you. In this life or any other." My father looked up at her with tears running down his face. "Phyllis, I don't know how to stop." And she told him, "Then we will figure it out. But not tonight. Tonight you are going to eat a bowl of beans and sit with your son." He ate the beans. He did not sleep. By August, he had not slept for more than an hour at a stretch in over 3 months. His hands shook so badly he could not pour a cup of coffee without spilling it. My mother said he looked like a man who was burning himself down from the inside, and she did not know what to do. And she was 23 years old, and she prayed every morning and every night because there was nothing else left. The first sound came at the end of August, late on a summer night, after my mother had given up on sleep and was sitting awake with a book. She was awake because she was always awake. She was sitting up in bed with me, asleep beside her, reading a Louis L'Amour paperback by the light of a kerosene lantern because the power had gone out earlier that evening in a thunderstorm. My father was in the kitchen, in his chair by the stove. He had been sitting there since full dark. The storm had passed an hour earlier, and the night outside was washed clean and very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after Appalachian rain, when the air is so cool and wet, you can feel it against your skin like cloth. She heard it through the open window, a low sound. She told me later she was not sure at first she had heard anything at all. It was more like pressure than noise, something she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. A long, low hum, slow, steady. It came from the direction of the ridge, from up in the timber above the pasture, and it lasted maybe 15 seconds, and then it stopped. She sat up. She listened. Nothing. Then it came again, longer this time, a long, low note, almost a drone, rising at the end like a question rises, and then falling back into silence. The hair on her forearm stood up, not from fear exactly, but from the strangeness of it. She had grown up in these mountains. She knew every animal in them. She knew the scream of a bobcat and the bark of a gray fox and the wavering call of a screech owl. This was none of those. It was nothing she had ever heard. She heard my father get up from his chair. She heard the screen door open. She heard the porch boards creak. and then she heard nothing for a long time. She put down the book. She slid out of bed, careful not to wake me, and she walked to the kitchen and looked out through the back door. My father was standing on the porch in his bare feet, in his undershirt, and he was not moving. He was facing the ridge. His hands hung at his sides. His shoulders, which had been up around his ears for 4 months, were down. It was the first time she had seen him standing still since he came home. The sound came a third time. She heard it clearly now, through the open door. A long, low, humming note, pitched lower than any human voice could go, held for maybe 20 seconds, and then falling away into the dark. And my father, on the porch, in the middle of the worst months of his life, did something my mother had not seen him do since he came home from the war. He exhaled. It was a full, deep breath, the kind you take when you have been holding your breath without knowing it. His shoulders dropped another inch. He leaned forward onto the railing with both hands, and he stood there with his head bowed, and she watched him from the kitchen doorway. He came inside about 20 minutes later. He walked past her without speaking and went into the bedroom and lay down on the bed and fell asleep within about 5 minutes, and he slept for 4 hours straight, the longest stretch he had slept since he came home. I was too young to remember any of this directly. I learned it in pieces, most of it from my mother, some of it from my father when he was ready to talk, and the deepest parts from him on an October evening in 1985 when I was 15 years old and he had decided it was time. I will come to that evening. But first I need to tell you what my mother knew and what the whole family came to know over the first 6 months of those visits. The sound came every night after that first one, not always at the same time, sometimes right after dark, sometimes not until after midnight, once or twice, not until the hour before dawn. But every night, and every night, my father would get up from his chair by the stove, walk out to the porch, and stand there listening. And every night, after the hum had come 2 or 3 times, he would come back inside and lie down and sleep. He slept. After 4 months of nightmares that had made my mother consider whether she needed to hide every sharp object in the house, after 4 months of my father holding himself together with an effort that was killing him, he slept. 4 hours at first, then 5, then 6. And when he slept, he did not scream. And when he woke, he was in Wise County, on 110 acres that had belonged to his father, with a wife who loved him and a son who was starting to recognize him, and the tools to begin becoming a man again. My mother did not understand what was happening. Not at first. She heard the sound too, every night, and she did not know what was making it. She asked my father once, about a week in, "Hank, what is that sound?" He looked at her across the kitchen table. He had just eaten a full plate of cornbread and pinto beans, the first full plate of food he had eaten since he had come home. He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't know, Phyllis, but it's helping me." "Helping you how?" "It's telling me I'm not there anymore. It's telling me I'm here. Every time I hear it, I come back a little further." She did not know what to say to that. She nodded. She did not ask again for a long time. By October, my father was sleeping 5 or 6 hours most nights. He had started eating again. He had gone down to the hardware store in Big Stone Gap and bought new work clothes because his old ones hung on him like sacks. He was talking to my mother again, a little, about things other than what he could see from the window. One afternoon he picked me up and held me, and I did not scream, and he carried me around the yard on his shoulders while she watched from the kitchen window and cried so hard she had to sit down on the floor. He was not a whole man yet. He would sit on the porch for an hour at a time some evenings without speaking. Long silences dropped on him at odd moments, in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a meal, and my mother learned not to pull him out of them. He jumped at loud noises. He would not go into the woods during the day. The mountains he had grown up in, the hollows he had hunted as a boy, had become a place he could not enter. My mother said he would walk out to the edge of the pasture and stop at the fence line and put his hands on the top wire and just stand there looking up at the ridge, and he could not make himself go in. But he could sit on the porch, and he could listen, and whatever was up there on the ridge kept coming, through October and into November, through the first frost and the first snow, and all the way through the coldest stretch of December when the temperature dropped below zero for 5 nights and the creek froze solid. The hum came, and my father slept. My mother started leaving the porch light on. She did not know why. Later, she told me it was a habit she started without thinking about it. She would turn on the porch light before dark and leave it on until morning. It was her way of saying thank you. A way of saying, whatever you are, I know you are there, and I am grateful, and the house is open to you. There was a night in mid-December of '71 that I only know about because my mother wrote it down, years later, in the margin of a cookbook she kept in the kitchen drawer. She had been making biscuits, and she had paused on a blank page at the back and written a date and a few sentences, and I found those sentences when I was cleaning out the house after she died. She had written, December 16th. Hank slept 7 hours. The worst storm of the year came through, and I heard him on the ridge between the gusts, calling once, twice, 3 times. He was checking on us. I went to the window and thanked him out loud. Hank did not wake up. I sat by the stove until dawn and watched my husband sleep the sleep of a man who is no longer afraid. She did not tell me about that night until she was in her 70s. By then my father had been gone less than a year, and she was starting to give her grandchildren stories she had held all her life. She told me she used to stand at the window in the worst of that first winter, looking up at the ridge, and she had the sense of being held by something much larger than herself, as though the whole mountain were cupping its hand around her small family and keeping the weather off. She said it was the closest she ever came to understanding what her grandmother had meant when her grandmother used to talk about old things in the hollows. Her grandmother had been born in 1879 in a cabin up Guest River. She had used the word haints for what her own grandmother had spoken of, and a word in Cherokee that my mother could not pronounce and could only remember the sound of, a word that meant, roughly, the ones who stand. My mother said that winter of '71 was when she finally understood her grandmother had not been superstitious. Her grandmother had been remembering. She did not see him until the night of January 30th, 1972. My mother remembered the date because it was a full moon, the old wolf moon her grandmother had always called it, and because a cold snap had settled in 3 days earlier and had not lifted. It was a clear night, maybe 10 below zero with no wind. The moon was full, and the snow on the pasture reflected the light back up into a sky so full of stars my mother said it looked dusted. She was standing at the kitchen window around 10 in the evening. My father was in the chair by the stove, dozing. I was asleep in the bedroom. She had been watching the ridge without quite knowing she was watching it, and then she saw movement, and she stopped breathing. A shape was coming down out of the timber above the pasture. Tall, very tall, walking upright. It moved along the fence line at the upper edge of the pasture and stopped at the gap where my father's trail went into the woods. It stood there for a long time. My mother could make out the silhouette against the snow. It was taller than any man she had ever seen, broader through the shoulders, standing with a weight she could feel from 150 yards away, rooted into the ground beyond what ordinary things are rooted into. She did not call to my father. She did not move. She stood at the window and watched. The shape raised its head. My mother told me later she was certain it was looking at the house itself, not at her, taking in the porch light, the smoke coming from the chimney, the warm yellow light in the windows. A family inside a small building in a hollow at the edge of a forest that ran on for more miles than a person could walk in a week. It stood there for what she estimated was 3 minutes. Then the hum came. Up close, it was a different thing than what she had been hearing through the walls. It filled the kitchen. It vibrated the window glass. It came up through the floorboards into the soles of her feet. A deep, held, rolling note that was not the sound of an animal, and was not the sound of a machine, and was not a sound she had any name for. It went on for perhaps 15 seconds, and then it faded, and the shape turned, and it walked back along the fence line and into the timber, and it was gone. My mother stood at the window for a long time after it left. She did not feel afraid. She felt seen. She felt careful attention turn briefly toward her small house and her sleeping child and her broken husband, and find them worth its time. She went to the bedroom. My father was lying on the bed now, breathing evenly, his face smooth in a way it had not been smooth since before the war. She lay down beside him and put her hand on his chest, and she said, quietly, into the dark, "Thank you, whoever you are, thank you." The next morning, when she went out to the porch, there was something on the top step, a small pile of sassafras roots, clean and uncut, arranged neatly, with the earth still dark on them from where they had been pulled. She stood there looking at them. Sassafras tea was something my grandmother had made for sick children. It settled the stomach. It calmed the nerves. She had not thought of it in years. She picked the roots up and took them inside and boiled them, and she brought my father a cup of sassafras tea at the kitchen table, and he looked at the steam rising from the cup for a long moment before he drank it. He did not ask where it came from. He knew. Those sassafras roots changed something. Up until that morning, what was happening on the ridge had been a medicine my father accepted without questioning, a voice in the dark that told him he was home. With the roots on the porch step, the one on the ridge had come closer. It had given something. It had made itself known as a being that paid attention, that understood, that was trying in its own way to help. And my father, for the first time since he had come home, started to think about who, or what, was up there. He did not go up the ridge for another 3 weeks. When he did, it was on a Sunday afternoon in early February, on one of those bright days when the snow is melting and the woods smell like wet wood smoke and the crows are talking to each other in the tops of the trees. My mother saw him putting on his boots. She almost stopped him, and then she decided not to. She watched him walk across the pasture and climb the stile over the fence and disappear into the timber, and she stood at the kitchen window with her heart in her throat for the next 3 hours, because this was the first time her husband had voluntarily entered a forest since May of 1971. He came back down at dusk. He walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table. My mother looked at him. His face was different, she told me later. Not peaceful exactly, but something in him had settled. "Did you see anything?" "No, but I sat on a log up there for a long time, and something watched me the whole time. And when I got up to leave, I heard it walk away, not running, walking, like it was making sure I knew it had been there." "Were you afraid?" "Phyllis, I have been afraid every minute since I came home. Today, up there on that ridge, for 3 hours, I was not afraid. I don't know what that means, but I know it's the first time." He went up the ridge every Sunday after that. He did not take a gun. He did not take a camera. He took himself, and he took the stillness that the war had beaten into him and then broken him with, and he offered it to whatever was up there, and whatever was up there accepted. The visits changed over the next several months. The hum still came at night, still pulled my father into the sleep that was slowly rebuilding him. But now, on his Sunday walks, he started to understand there was a specific place on the ridge where the one up there liked to be. It was a flat spot, maybe 40 feet across, where the sandstone rim opened up into a shelf overlooking the hollow. A big tulip poplar stood at the edge, and 3 smaller hemlocks made a wall against the north wind. My father started calling it the sitting place. He said it felt different from the rest of the ridge. The air was different there. The sounds of the forest seemed to gather and then soften, like sounds gather and soften in the nave of an empty church. He would go to the sitting place. He would sit down with his back against the tulip poplar, and he would wait. The first time he saw him clearly was in April of 1972. I was 2 years old. My mother was 4 months pregnant with my sister Lucille. My father had been home from the war for almost a year, and he had gone from a man holding himself together by his fingernails to a man who could hold a baby on his knee and make him laugh, and who could sleep through most of a night in most weeks, and who could eat a full meal without being coaxed. He was still not the man my mother had married in 1967. That man, she said, was gone forever. But the man who had taken his place was a man she could build a life with, and she was grateful for him every day. On an April afternoon, my father went up to the sitting place. The woods were full of the sound of running water from the snowmelt. Serviceberry was blooming white along the lower edge of the ridge. He sat down with his back against the tulip poplar, and he closed his eyes and he breathed the air, which was the air of his home, the air he had thought he would never smell again during the worst nights over there. He sat there for a long time, and then something very large sat down across from him. He did not hear him arrive. He said he felt the air move, the way air moves when someone sits down near you in a quiet room. He opened his eyes. He was sitting about 15 feet away, with his back against one of the hemlocks. He was watching my father. My father had grown up in these mountains. He had hunted black bears since he was 10. He had tracked deer through snow and fog and rain his entire life. He knew what every living thing in this forest looked like, and he knew what was sitting across from him was not any of them. He had a face, not a snout. A face, broad and flat, with heavy brows over eyes that were dark and large and placed forward on the skull like human eyes are placed forward, meant for focusing on another set of eyes. His head hair was long, falling past his shoulders, dark brown shot through with silver around the temples. His body was covered in dense hair, the same dark brown, darker on the shoulders and lighter on the chest. He was sitting cross-legged, like a person might sit, with his hands resting on his knees, and his hands were enormous, with fingers as long as the length of my father's whole hand, and palms that were dark and worn and deeply lined. My father did not move. He could not have moved if he had wanted to. He said his whole body had gone still the way bodies go still, when they are in the presence of something they cannot explain but can feel to be important. They looked at each other for a long time. My father said he could not tell how long. Minutes, maybe longer. The forest around them did not go quiet, which he said was the strangest part. The birds kept calling. The stream kept running. Whatever was sitting across from him was part of the forest, and the forest knew it, and the forest had not stopped. And then he hummed, up close, with no wall between them, with the sound coming from 15 feet away out of a chest the size of a whiskey barrel. The hum was the strangest thing my father had ever felt. He said it was not like hearing music. It was like being played. The low frequency moved through his bones. It settled in his sternum and spread outward into his ribs and down his spine. It reached places inside him that had been clenched for nearly 5 years, the places that had locked themselves shut in the first firefight and had not opened since, and it touched those places, and the places let go. My father, who had not cried in front of another person since his mother's funeral in 1963, sat against that tulip poplar with his eyes open, looking at someone out of the old stories his grandmother had told him when he was a boy. And he cried, not sobbing, just tears, running steadily down his face and soaking into the collar of his flannel shirt. And the one across from him sat with him while he cried. He did not come closer. He did not reach out. He did not do anything except stay present and continue to hum, low and steady, for as long as my father needed him to. When the hum stopped, my father said, his face was wet, and his chest felt hollowed out like a room feels hollowed out after a long argument has ended. The one across from him looked at him for another minute. Then he stood up. He was nearly 8 feet tall, my father estimated. He moved with a slow grace that did not match his size, as though gravity were a suggestion he was choosing to honor. He stepped away from the hemlock. He walked to the edge of the sitting place. Before he went over the rim, he turned and looked back at my father, and he raised one of those enormous hands, and he held the hand up, palm out, for about 3 seconds. Then he was gone. My father sat against the tulip poplar for another hour. He did not move. He said he could feel his own heart beating in a way he had not felt it beat in years, steady and slow, and his breathing was deep and even, and the part of him that had been burning since the war was, for the moment, quiet. He said he understood, sitting there, that he had just been given a gift. He did not yet know what, but he knew it was the most important thing that had ever happened to him, and he knew he was not going to tell anyone about it. Not then, not for a very long time, because naming it would be an act of smallness against a presence that deserved more. He walked home at dusk. He did not tell my mother what had happened. Not then. She could tell something had changed, because he came into the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment, and then he kissed her forehead, and he went and picked me up out of the playpen and held me against his chest for a long time. She asked him what had happened up there. "Phyllis, I think I'm going to be all right." "I know you are, Hank." And she did know. She had been watching him for a year, and from the first night of the hum, she had been watching him come back. The sitting place became a regular thing. My father went up there every Sunday for the rest of that year, and the one on the ridge came to him most of those Sundays. Sometimes he hummed, and sometimes he did not. Sometimes he stayed 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. Across the spring and summer and fall of 1972, my father went from being a man broken by a war to being a man who had been mended. He spent the rest of his life honoring the word mended because it was the right word and fixed was not. But in the late summer of '73, when I was 3 years old and my sister Lucille was just over a year, something happened that nearly ended all of it. My Uncle Wendell, my mother's older brother, came to stay with us for deer season, and Uncle Wendell brought his rifle. And Uncle Wendell did not know what he did not know. And on a gray Saturday morning in November of 1973, he came within about 3 pounds of trigger pressure of shooting the one who had saved my father's life. I will tell it. But first, one more thing, because it matters. When my mother went out to the porch on the morning after my father's first clear sighting, the morning of that April Sunday in '72, she found something on the top step. Not sassafras this time. A feather, long and brown and barred, from the wing of a great horned owl. Beside it, a smooth stone, a piece of river quartz about the size of a hen's egg, polished to a soft gloss by years in water. And beside that, a single strand of long, coarse, dark brown hair, about 18 inches long, laid out with care on the wood. She picked up the hair and held it up to the morning light, and she looked at it for a long time. Then, she wrapped all 3 gifts in a clean handkerchief, and she put them in the bottom of her cedar chest, and she did not show them to my father for 13 years. I know this because she showed them to me first. On an October evening in 1985, the year I turned 15, after my father and I had come down from the ridge together for what would be the first and last time we went up there as a pair. She opened the cedar chest and took out the handkerchief and laid the 3 things on the kitchen table, and she said, "Brent, your father has something he wants to tell you, and these belong to the story." Uncle Wendell arrived on a Friday afternoon in the middle of November 1973, driving a 1966 Ford F-100 that he had owned since it was new, and he was in a mood. He was always in a mood. Wendell Stapleton was my mother's oldest brother, 17 years older than her and the firstborn of my grandmother's 9 children, and he had been a hard man since before anybody could remember. He had worked underground at the Jewel Ridge mine for 22 years, and had come out with black lung and a bad back and a bitterness he wore like other men wore a coat. He was 42 years old that fall. He lived alone in Norton, in a single-wide trailer that he kept immaculately clean, and he was the best deer hunter in the family. My father respected him. My father respected anyone who could hold his own in the woods. But Wendell was a man who had never in his life been told there was something he did not know, and that fact was about to matter more than any of us could have predicted. He came for the second weekend of deer season. He brought a .30-30 Winchester, a sleeping bag, and a bottle of 10 High bourbon. He set up in the spare bedroom and he told my mother that he would be in the woods before light and back after dark, and he would not need feeding until supper because he knew how to feed himself. He ate the supper my mother cooked without a word of thanks, but also without complaint, which for Wendell was the same as a standing ovation. He went to bed at 8. My mother heard him snoring through the wall within 15 minutes. My father sat on the porch that night until almost midnight, and when the hum came from the ridge, he stood up and faced the timber, and he did something my mother had never seen him do before. He spoke out loud into the dark. He said, "Not tonight. Stay back tonight. There's somebody here I don't trust with you." The hum stopped mid-note. It did not come back. My father sat down and closed his eyes, and he did not sleep well that night, for the first time in a year. Wendell was out of the house before 5 in the morning. He took the old logging road up the west side of the pasture, which was the wrong side of the ridge for deer, but the easiest climb for a man with a bad back. He meant to sit at the top of the west slope, where a natural bench made a good blind, and wait for deer moving toward the creek in the evening. That was not where he ended up. The west bench was occupied by another hunter, a neighbor from 3 hollows over, who had the same idea. Wendell cursed him quietly and kept moving east along the top of the ridge, looking for another spot. And at about 8 in the morning, as the light was coming up gray and cold through the tulip poplars, he came to the sitting place. He did not know it was the sitting place. To him it was a flat shelf of sandstone with a big poplar and 3 hemlocks, and it had a view down into a drainage that might or might not hold deer. He sat down at the edge of the rim with his back against a rock, and he waited. At about 9:30, he heard something large moving through the timber below him. He had hunted these mountains his whole life. He knew the sound of a deer moving. He knew the sound of a bear. He knew the sound of a man. What he was hearing was none of those. Something heavy was coming up the ridge toward him, moving careful, not hurried. He raised his rifle. He eased the safety off. He waited. The one on the ridge came up through the timber into the clearing below the rim. Wendell was above him, looking down, and he had maybe a 20-yard shot through an opening in the brush. He saw the top of a head, dark brown hair, long, falling to shoulder level. He thought for 1 second it might be a man, and then he saw the size of the shoulders, and he understood it was not a man. He thought it was a bear, a big black bear, standing on 2 legs. That was what his brain told him, because that was the only category his brain had for something that size in these woods. He settled the front sight on where the heart should be. He let his breath out, and then the one below him turned his head and looked up the ridge, straight at him, and Wendell Stapleton saw his face. He told me, 38 years later, on a cold afternoon in March of 2011, about 6 months before he died of a lung infection that started as a cold and finished what the coal dust had started, that when that face looked up at him, he had the clearest thought of his life. He said the thought was this, and he said it with tears in his eyes, which was not a thing I had ever seen Wendell Stapleton do. He said the thought was, "That is a person, and I have a rifle pointed at his chest." He said his finger, which had been inside the trigger guard, came out. He said the rifle, without his telling it to, lowered from his shoulder and rested across his knees. He said he sat there, hidden behind the rock, looking down at the one in the clearing, and the one in the clearing looked back at him, and they stayed that way for maybe a full minute. Then he stepped backward, slowly, 1 step, then another, without turning his back, and he melted into the timber like smoke into air, and he was gone. Wendell sat on that rim for another 2 hours. He did not move. He did not hunt. He did not see a deer, although one walked within 30 yards of him during that time, and he told me later he did not raise the rifle. He said he could not have raised the rifle to kill anything that day, not after what he had seen. Whatever part of him was a hunter, whatever part of him had walked into these woods every November of his adult life, looking to take a life, had been shut off like a valve. He walked down the ridge at noon. He did not tell anyone what he had seen. That evening, at the supper table, my mother noticed he was quiet. quieter than usual. He did not touch his bourbon. He ate his supper and pushed the plate back, and he looked at my father across the table with an expression my mother had never seen on her brother's face before. It looked like he was trying to work something out. My father looked back at him. They held each other's eyes for a long moment. And my mother, who had grown up with both of them, knew in that moment that something had happened on the ridge, and she knew both men knew it, and she decided to say nothing. After supper, Wendell went out to the porch. My father followed him. My mother kept herself in the kitchen with the door cracked, doing dishes as slowly as she could, because she wanted to hear what was said. Wendell said, "Hank." My father said, "Wendell." There was a long silence. Wendell took a drink of water from the glass my mother had set out for him, and he turned the glass in his hands, and the only sound on the porch was the creak of the rocking chair and a single whippoorwill calling up in the ridge. "Timber. I was up on the east rim this morning, above that flat place with the big poplar. I know that place. Something came up that ridge." And my father, very quietly, "Wendell, whatever you saw today, I want you to know something. It has been coming to this house almost every night for 2.5 years. It started coming the summer I got home from over there, when I could not sleep, when I was losing my mind. It came, and it hummed at the tree line, and it made it so I could sleep, and it has been sleeping me ever since. My children have grown up with it at the edge of this yard, and it has never once come closer than the tree line, and it has never once done anything except help. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Wendell did not answer for a long time. He looked out into the dark where the pasture ended and the timber began, and his jaw worked the way his jaw worked when he was chewing over a hard thing, and finally he closed his eyes. "I had a bead on him this morning. Heart shot. 20 yards. I know you did. Hank, if I had pulled that trigger, what would that have done to you?" "It would have killed me too, Wendell. Maybe not that day, but eventually. Whatever he is up there, he is the reason I am sitting across from you tonight instead of lying under a stone in the Stonega Cemetery. If you had shot him, I would have lost the one thing that has been bringing me back, and I do not know if I would have survived that." Wendell sat down in the rocking chair on the porch, and he put his face in his hands, and my mother, standing in the kitchen doorway, watched her older brother, the hardest man she had ever known, sit on her back porch with his hands over his face for a long time without making a sound. When he finally put his hands down, his eyes were red, and he looked at my father. "Hank, I did not pull that trigger, and I am never going to pull it, and nobody is ever going to pull it, not while I am alive to stop them. That is my word to you, and I have never broken my word in my life, and I am not going to start now. I know you won't, Wendell, but you need to tell me what he is. I need to hear it out loud, because otherwise, I am going to think I have lost my mind." So my father told him. He told him, sitting on the porch in the November cold with a kerosene lantern burning between them, about the first night of the hum, about the sassafras roots, about the sitting place, about the first clear sighting in April of '72. He told him everything he had not told my mother in full, either. She heard it through the kitchen door, and she sat down on the kitchen floor and cried, because her husband had carried this thing by himself for 2.5 years and had never once been able to share the whole of it with her, and now she was hearing it for the first time through a crack in a door while her brother listened. When my father finished, Wendell was quiet for another long while. "Hank, I want to come with you. Someday. Not to hunt. Not to do anything. I just want to sit with you in that place. I want to know if he will come to me too. Maybe. Not this trip. Maybe next year. We'll see what he tells us." Wendell went home on Sunday. He did not hunt again that weekend. He never hunted in our woods again. He went back to hunting public land in Dickinson County for the rest of his life, and he never carried a rifle onto my father's property after November of 1973. He did come back to the ridge, though, one Sunday in April of 1975. He drove down from Norton in the old phone 100 and he brought no gun, only a thermos of black coffee and a sack of sausage biscuits my mother had made him the night before. He and my father walked up the logging road together in the early morning, not talking, and they sat at the sitting place for 3 hours. The one up there did not appear. But about 90 minutes in, a stone came sailing down out of the timber above the rim and landed in the moss between their boots. Not thrown hard, placed, my father said. A small river-worn stone, similar to the one on the porch step from 3 years before. Wendell picked it up and turned it in his fingers, and he did not say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, "Hank, I think he's telling me he knows." My father nodded. "I think he is." Wendell put the stone in his shirt pocket and kept it there for the rest of his life. When he died in 2011, my cousin Kenny found it in the shirt pocket of the flannel Wendell had been wearing the day he went into the hospital, and he gave it to me at the funeral along with the letter. It is in the cedar chest too, now, with everything else. Wendell told me once, years later, that the feeling of being watched by someone who had decided not to kill him was the closest thing to being forgiven he had ever felt in his life. He said the stone was proof of it. He said he had come close to being a man he could not have lived with, and someone in the woods had chosen to let him off, and he had spent the rest of his life trying to be worthy of that choice. He stopped drinking that same year. He started going to church again for the first time since his wife had left him in 1968. He made peace with his grown son before he died. He was not an easy man, even after, but he was a better one. The hum came back the night after Wendell left in '73. My father stood on the porch and said out loud, "He's gone, and he understands. You can come back." And it came back. And it kept coming, every night, for another 3.5 years. The years between '73 and '77 were the quiet years. My father worked at a lumber mill in Norton. Lucille grew out of the baby stage. I went from 3 to 7. We lived the kind of life Wise County families have always lived. We had a garden. We had chickens. We had a Sears riding mower my father fought with every Saturday from April to October. The ridge behind the house became part of our weather, the way some families have a view of the ocean that becomes part of their weather. My father went up every Sunday. The hum came most nights. Lucille and I grew up taking it for granted the way children take everything for granted, as though the world had always been exactly the shape it was right then, and it is only when you are grown and the world has changed that you realize it was ever anything else. In 1977, the hum stopped. It did not stop suddenly. It tapered. Through the spring and summer of '77, my father, who was now 34 years old and had been home from the war for 6 years and had become a whole man again, noticed that the nightly visits were becoming less frequent. 2 nights a week, then 1, then once every 10 days. And then, in the middle of August, the one on the ridge came to the edge of the pasture for the last time. My mother saw him from the bedroom window. She had been watching for him most evenings for 6 years, even though she rarely saw him clearly. That night he came down out of the timber in the full moon, and he walked all the way across the pasture, closer to the house than he had ever come before. He stopped about 40 feet from the back porch. My father was already outside. He had felt him coming, he said later, the way you feel a thunderstorm coming when the pressure changes. He walked off the porch. He walked out across the grass. He stopped about 15 feet from him. They looked at each other in the moonlight. My father told me, years later, that in that moment he could see the silver clearly around the temples, more than he remembered from the sitting place, and the lines around the eyes, and the slight slowness in how he carried his shoulders, which had not been slow before. He had grown older along with my father. 6 years had passed for both of them, and both of them had used those years. My father said the thought that went through his head was the same thought a man has when he is watching a childhood friend walk up to a train that will take him far away. That is my friend, and my friend is leaving. And both of those things are true at once. And both of those things are all right, because my friend has done what he came to do. He raised one of those enormous hands, palm out, the same gesture he had made on the day of their first clear meeting, more than 5 years earlier. My father raised his hand, palm out. They held the gesture for maybe 10 seconds. My father told me he was trying with everything in him to put the whole of his gratitude into the space between their hands, to push it across that 15 feet of damp grass, to give this one some small piece of what had been given to him. And he said that somewhere in those 10 seconds, he felt the gift land. He did not know how he knew, but the one on the ridge understood. And in whatever way he had, he gave back. A last hum, not loud, more like the memory of a hum, a pressure in the chest that said, I know what you are saying. You are welcome. Go on now. Then he turned and walked back across the pasture and climbed the fence line and went up into the timber, and my father stood in the moonlight until he was out of sight. He came back inside. He was crying. My mother was standing in the kitchen in her nightgown, and she went to him, and she held him, and he spoke into her shoulder. He told me he was going. I don't know how I know, but he told me. He said, I don't need him anymore. The hum did not come the next night, or the night after. My father slept. He slept like a man who had earned his sleep. And after about 2 weeks of no hum, of silence from the ridge, he understood the visits were over. The work was done. Whatever had happened between him and the one on the ridge across those 6 years had brought him all the way home. And his friend, who did not belong to him and had never belonged to him, had gone back to his own world. My father lived 41 more years after that night in August of 77. He got a job at a power company in Abingdon in 78 and worked there for 26 years. He and my mother had 3 more children after me and Lucille. He coached my Little League baseball team. He sat in the front pew at church every Sunday and prayed with a sincerity that I think was partly for the one on the ridge, although he never said so. He took me hunting in the fall and taught me to shoot. He taught me to split wood and change the oil in a truck, and to listen more than I talked. He was a good father, a good man. The kind of man you would not have guessed, looking at him, had nearly broken himself to pieces in the summer of 1971. He told me the full story on an October evening in 1985, the year I turned 15. He had been hinting at it for a couple of years. He would mention the ridge in passing. He would talk about the old sounds from when I was small, and my mother would look at him and something would pass between them that I did not understand. On that particular evening, he asked me to walk with him up to the sitting place before supper. I had never been up there with him. I had grown up hearing about the ridge the way you hear about church, as a thing that had its own rules and its own rhythms, something my father kept private the way other fathers kept tools or books private. He went up every Sunday still, though he rarely stayed more than an hour anymore, and he had stopped calling it the sitting place out loud when us kids were around. We walked up the ridge in the late afternoon light. The woods were loud with the sound of acorns dropping and squirrels cutting on the higher branches, and the leaves were at their full turn, orange and scarlet and gold, and the air smelled like wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney 2 hollows over. My father walked ahead of me. He did not talk much on the climb. When we reached the sitting place, he stopped at the edge, and he took a long breath. Brent, sit down. I have something to tell you. And he told me. All of it. The war, the nightmares, the first night of the hum, the sassafras roots, the first sighting, the business with Uncle Wendell, the last night of the hum. He told me for 2 hours, sitting with his back against the tulip poplar, which was a little bigger than it had been in 72, but not by much. Trees that old mostly grow into themselves rather than upward. He did not cry while he told it, but I did. I was 15. I was a kid who had loved his father without understanding him, and on that October afternoon, I started to understand I had been loved and protected and raised by a man who had been saved from himself by someone in these woods whose name none of us would ever know. When he finished, We sat in silence for a long time. The light was going. The air was getting colder. Finally, I asked, "Dad, is he still out there?" He thought for a moment. "I don't know, Brent. I haven't seen him since that August night in '77. I come up here because this is where it happened, and because I owe this place a certain kind of attention, and because I don't want to forget. But I have not heard him, and I have not seen him, and I think, maybe, he is living his own life somewhere back in there, the way he would have lived it if he had never had to come out to help me at all. Do you think he's still alive?" "Brent, his kind live a long time. I think he is. I think he is somewhere back in that country, and he has had mates and children and grandchildren by now, and he has not thought about me in 20 years, and that is as it should be. I got what I needed. The debt is mine. I carry it. I don't want him to carry anything." We walked down the ridge in the gathering dark. When we got to the kitchen, my mother was waiting with the cedar chest gifts laid out on the table. The owl feather, the quartz stone, the strand of hair. She had kept them for 13 years. She told me, in front of my father, about the first morning after the first clear sighting, and about leaving the porch light on, and about how those gifts had been her own small piece of what had happened, her own private conversation with the one on the ridge, because it had never been only my father's story. It had been all of ours. A family saved by someone who had no reason to care, and had cared anyway. I kept the story. I did not tell my friends. I did not tell my teachers. I did not tell any of the girlfriends I brought home in high school. I carried it, the way my father had carried it, the way my mother had carried her 3 small objects in a handkerchief at the bottom of a cedar chest. I married my wife, Lauren, in 1993. I told her the whole story on the 3rd date, because I needed to know if she could hear it, and she could, and she married me anyway. Our 2 daughters grew up on this land. They have been up to the sitting place. I have told them the story. They have told their own children, my grandchildren, who are 9 and 6 years old, and who already know there is a ridge behind Grandpa Brent's house where someone lives who helped their great-grandfather come home from a war. My father died in 2019. Heart failure, quiet and quick, in his own bed, with my mother holding his hand. He was 76 years old. At the funeral, Uncle Wendell's son Kenny, who had not known any of this until the eulogy when I told a version of the story that most people took for metaphor, came up to me afterward and said, "Brent, my dad wanted me to give you something when your father passed." He handed me a folded piece of paper. It was a letter in Wendell's handwriting, dated 2009, 2 years before Wendell died. It said, "Brent, if you are reading this, your father is gone. I want you to know that the one on the ridge saved my life too, in a different way than he saved your father, but he saved it. Because in the 36 years since that morning on the East Rim, I have thought about what kind of man I would have been if I had pulled that trigger. I would have been a man who shot a praying thing, and that knowledge would have ruined me. The man I became instead, the one who learned to stop taking what did not need to be taken, is the only man I ever liked being. Tell him, if you ever see him again, that an old miner in Norton is grateful. Your uncle, Wendell." I put the letter in the same cedar chest where my mother's 3 small gifts had lived since 1972. They are all still in there. The owl feather has softened a little with the years. The quartz stone is exactly the way it was. The strand of hair is wrapped in tissue paper now, because I wanted to protect it. I go up to the sitting place about once a month, always alone. Sometimes I sit for an hour, sometimes for 3. I have not heard the hum. I have not seen any sign of him. The tulip poplar has grown some. The hemlocks are mostly gone now, killed by the adelgid that came through the Appalachians some years back. And the 3 that used to stand along the north edge of the shelf are skeletons now, gray and bare. The needles long dropped. The sandstone rim is the same as it has always been, because sandstone rims do not change on any timescale that matters to people. I sit there and I listen to the forest, and I know that somewhere back in the dark timber, in a place I will never go and do not need to go, there may still be an old friend with graying hair around the temples, sitting by himself on a ledge somewhere, listening to a different part of this mountain. Or maybe there isn't. Maybe he has died, the way old things die, and gone back into the ground. But if he has, I know, because my father taught me this without ever saying it, that his kind do not die of aging. They die because it is time. And he would have gone on his own terms, and the mountain would have taken him back the way it takes everything it loves. My father came home from a war that had taken something out of him. The people who sent him over there did not know how to put back. The doctors could not put it back. The pills could not put it back. His own family, who loved him, could not put it back, not on their own. What put it back was someone in the woods who had no reason to care and cared anyway, who sat with him in silence and hummed at him from the tree line until he could sleep, who asked for nothing, and who, when the work was done, walked back into his own forest and let my father live his life. I do not know what he was. My father did not know either, and he spent the rest of his days thinking about it without arriving at any answer he thought was worthy of the question. What I know is what my father knew. There is kindness in this world that does not belong to the world we talk about. There are ones at the edges of our maps who look in at us the way we look at them, and who sometimes, for reasons we will never understand, decide that one of us is worth helping. The old stories my grandmother told about things that lived in the deep hollows and watched the edges of farms and made sounds in the night that were not any animal and not any person, were not stories. They were memory, a memory that goes deeper than books. My father was a man who had been to hell, and who had been pulled back from it by a hand he could not see, that belonged to a body he only saw clearly a few times in his life, and that had never once intended to be seen at all. He spent the rest of his days trying to be worthy of that help. He raised 4 children. He loved my mother for 52 years. He went to work. He came home. He sat on the porch in the evenings with a cup of coffee, and he watched the ridge turn gold in the late light. And sometimes, when nobody was looking, he would raise one hand, palm out, the way a man greets an old friend across a distance too great for words. I saw him do it 100 times. I only understood what it was in the last few years of his life. Now I sit on the same porch. I watch the same ridge. And every now and then, on a certain kind of evening when the light is right, I raise my hand too, palm out, because my father taught me to, and because I want whatever might still be up there to know that the family he helped is still here, still grateful, still watching the ridge, still leaving the porch light on in case anyone he loves ever needs to find his way home through the dark. My father's name was Hank Tate. He was a good man. He became a good man because someone in the forest behind our house decided, one August night in 1971, to stand at the edge of our pasture and hum at a broken soldier until the soldier could sleep. And he slept, and he healed, and he lived. Thank you, old friend. Wherever you are, thank you.